"She's a drug addict," my dad roared in court. I sat quietly. The judge turned to him and asked, "Are you sure you know what she does?" His lawyer froze. Dad's face went gray. "Wait, no." The room went dead silent. My aunt gasped like she'd been waiting years to hear it confirmed out loud. Her hand pressed dramatically to her chest, the way she always did when she wanted everyone to notice she was having a reaction. My dad stood there with his arm still extended, finger pointed at me, chest heaving like he'd just won something he'd been chasing for over a decade. A couple of my cousins exchanged glances, unsure whether to look at him or at me, unsure which reaction was the safe one to have in a room where everyone had already decided what side they were on before the hearing even started. He didn't know I'd been sober for 11 years. He never asked. He just kept the version of me from when I was 20 and never bothered updating it. No matter how much time passed or how many holidays went by where I showed up steady and quiet and fine, bringing side dishes and helping clear plates and saying almost nothing about my own life, because I'd learned a long time ago that nothing I said would change what he'd already decided about me. I want to explain how we got here, because none of this happened overnight. It took years, the kind of years that build up slowly, the way water wears down stone, until one day you look back and realize the shape of everything has changed without a single dramatic moment marking the transition. I was the second child in a family that had already decided, long before I was old enough to have any say in the matter, exactly what role each of us was going to play. My older brother was the responsible one. He got good grades without trying hard, never caused trouble, moved through his 20s in a straight line that made everyone comfortable. I was the complicated one, the one who required explanation at family gatherings, whose name got lowered in volume when relatives asked how I was doing, as if my life were a medical condition that needed to be discussed carefully so as not to upset anyone. Something changed around the time I turned 19. I lost my closest friend that year, someone I'd known since middle school, and her absence left a hole I didn't know how to fill with anything healthy. I made choices in the months that followed that I'm not proud of. By 20, things had gotten bad enough that people around me started to notice. My mother noticed quietly, leaving pamphlets on my dresser that I pretended not to see. My father noticed differently. He stopped introducing me by name at church functions and started introducing me as, "My daughter, she's going through some things," which even then felt less like concern and more like a preemptive apology for whatever I might do next. I won't walk through every detail of that period. Some of it is mine to keep private even now, but I will say it lasted roughly 2 years, and that at the end of it, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I got help. Real, structured help. The kind that involves showing up to places you don't want to go and doing work that doesn't feel rewarding until much later. It took the better part of a year before I felt like myself again, and longer before I felt like a version of myself I actually respected. My father was there for exactly none of that work. He knew the broad strokes because my mother kept him informed, but he never asked me directly how I was doing, not once. He treated the situation the way some people treat a renovation they don't want to think about. He closed the door on that part of the house and stopped walking past it. When I came out the other side, sober and steady and genuinely proud of the work I'd done, I expected something to shift. It didn't. If anything, it calcified. The version of me that existed at 20 became permanent, preserved like an insect in amber, brought out at every gathering as shorthand for why I was different, why certain conversations weren't appropriate in front of me, as if honesty itself might trigger some kind of relapse. I stopped correcting people eventually. Explaining never helped. Defending yourself against an accusation that's already been decided as true just reads, to people who've made up their minds, as further evidence of the thing you're denying. So I went quiet. I built my life without narrating it to my family. I got my education. I built a career I was proud of, one I chose specifically because of what I'd been through, though I never explained that connection to anyone because I knew exactly how it would be received. Not as growth, but as proof. My work required a level of confidentiality my father didn't understand, and I think didn't want to. I couldn't talk about specifics, who I worked with, the details of individual cases. That kind of discretion isn't optional in my field. But my father didn't see confidentiality. He saw evasion. In his mind, a person with nothing to hide would talk openly about their job, and since I didn't, he filled in the blank himself, always with the least generous interpretation available. 3 years passed like that, then 5, then almost 11. My mother stopped arguing with him somewhere around year 4, not because she agreed with him, but because arguing only made him dig in harder. My brother avoided the subject entirely, changing topics smoothly whenever my name came up in a context that might require an opinion. And slowly, the entire extended family absorbed my father's version of events as simply the truth, the way a lie repeated often enough by a confident enough voice can eventually replace whatever actually happened. I'm not telling this story to make myself sound like a saint. I made real mistakes. I hurt people during a difficult period of my life, and I've spent years working to be someone different, someone better, someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. But there's a difference between accountability and being frozen in time by someone else's refusal to see you as anything other than your worst moment, magnified and preserved indefinitely for their convenience. That's the context you need to understand what happened in that courtroom, because the outburst, the accusation, the 4 words that echoed off the walls of a room full of people I'd known my entire life didn't come out of nowhere. It came from 11 years of a story that had never been allowed to update, finally colliding with a version of me my father had never once bothered to meet. The dispute that brought us into that courtroom had nothing to do with drugs or sobriety or anything from my past at all. It was about my grandmother's estate. She'd passed away 8 months earlier at 84 after a slow decline that gave the whole family plenty of time to prepare and apparently plenty of time to start positioning. She'd left left behind a modest but real estate, the house she'd lived in for 4 decades, some savings, a small portfolio of investments she'd built quietly over the years without anyone in the family really noticing until the value of it became relevant to people's plans. And she'd left instructions, specific ones, about how it should be divided and managed, instructions that named me as one of 2 co-trustees responsible for overseeing the distribution. I want to be honest about how surprised I was by that. My grandmother and I had always been close, closer than most people in the family realized, because our relationship existed mostly outside the visibility of everyone else. She used to call me on Sunday afternoons, just to talk, no agenda, no checking up, just conversation. She never once brought up my past the way the rest of the family did. She used to say that people who'd been through hard things and come out the other side were often the most trustworthy people you could find, because they understood the actual weight of trust, understood what it cost to earn it back once it had been lost. I didn't know she'd named me as co-trustee until the will was read. My father was in the room when the attorney said my name out loud, and I watched his face do something complicated, something that started as surprise and slowly resolved into an expression I recognized from a decade of watching him decide, in real time, how a piece of information should be filed away to fit the story he already believed about me. The other co-trustee was my brother. That part made sense to everyone. Nobody questioned his inclusion for a second. My inclusion, though, became something people felt entitled to discuss, sometimes in front of me, sometimes in whispers they thought I couldn't hear, though I usually could. Within a few weeks, disagreements started surfacing about how the estate should actually be managed. Should the house be sold immediately or held for a period first? Should the investment portfolio be liquidated or maintained under professional management? Small, ordinary questions that families navigate all the time. Except in our family, every question became an opportunity to relitigate who could be trusted with responsibility and who couldn't. My father inserted himself into these conversations aggressively, despite not being a trustee himself. He had opinions about every decision, and increasingly his opinions circled back to the same argument, that I shouldn't be making decisions about anything involving money, given my history. He started saying this to other relatives before he ever said it to me directly. I found out about most of these conversations secondhand, from cousins who felt awkward enough about what they were hearing that they eventually mentioned it to me, half apologizing, half fishing for confirmation of whatever version they'd already been told. One evening, about 2 months into the dispute, I got a call from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Her voice sounded hesitant from the moment I picked up. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble, "that you're not capable of managing anything because of your history?" I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, looking out the window at nothing in particular, feeling something in my chest go very still and very tired. Not angry exactly, just tired, the specific exhaustion of hearing the same accusation raised as a casual question by someone who genuinely thought they were just checking facts. "It's been 11 years, I said quietly. 11 years since the hardest period of my life. That's what you're asking about, right? Something that happened when I was 20? There was a pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her breathing, deciding what to say next. "I didn't realize it was that long ago," she finally said. "Nobody ever asks how long ago it was. They just ask if it's true, as if the timeline doesn't matter." She didn't have a good answer for that, and the conversation drifted somewhere else, the way uncomfortable conversations do when neither person wants to keep pushing. But after I hung up, I sat with what had happened for a long time, because that call told me something important. My father wasn't just repeating an old story to relatives who already knew the history and had frozen it in place. He was actively spreading a current claim, phrased as though it were an ongoing concern, to people who had every reason to take him at his word, since he was, after all, my father, and who would know better than a father. That was the moment I stopped hoping this would resolve itself quietly. I stopped waiting for time or good behavior or quiet consistency to eventually undo 11 years of a narrative that clearly wasn't going anywhere on its own. If my father was going to keep making claims about my present, not just my past, then at some point those claims were going to need to meet actual scrutiny, actual evidence, something more substantial than a decade-old memory delivered with enough confidence to sound current. I called an attorney the following week, not because I wanted a fight, but because I finally understood that avoiding one hadn't done anything except let the story grow larger and more entrenched with every year. I stayed quiet. Her name was Rebecca, and during our first meeting, she asked me a question nobody in my family had asked in 11 years. What's actually true right now? Not what happened. What's true today? I told her. All of it. My sobriety date, my education, my career, the parts I could discuss and the parts I couldn't due to confidentiality. Though I explained the shape of that confidentiality clearly enough that she understood it wasn't evasion, it was professional obligation. My financial history, which was unremarkable in the best possible way. Steady income, no debt beyond a manageable mortgage, no red flags of any kind for over a decade. Rebecca listened to all of it without reacting much, the way good attorneys do, cataloging rather than judging. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me. "You've spent 11 years building a case for yourself without realizing that's what you were doing. All we have to do now is actually present it." We spent the next several weeks gathering documentation, employment records, certifications, letters from colleagues and supervisors who could speak to my reliability, written without any awareness they were being collected for a legal proceeding, which somehow made them more powerful than anything solicited specifically for this purpose. Financial records showing over a decade of responsible management of my own affairs. It felt strange, assembling proof of an ordinary, stable life. But I understood by that point that ordinary evidence was exactly what this situation required, because my father's entire argument argument depended on nobody ever actually checking. 3 weeks before the hearing, my mother called me. She rarely called just to talk anymore. Most of our conversations by that point were logistics, brief and careful. Your father is telling people you might contest the whole trust out of spite, she said, that you're going to try to take the house just to prove a point. That's not true. I know, she said, and something in her voice cracked slightly just for a second. I know it's not true. I just don't know how to make him hear that. I didn't have an answer for her either. I'd stopped believing, somewhere in the previous few years, that there was any combination of words that could make my father hear something he'd already decided not to. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I remember very specifically what I wore, a plain navy suit I'd bought for a work conference 2 years earlier, because Rebecca had told me, only half joking, that courtrooms respond to the visual language of stability, and I wanted every visual signal to be working in my favor, since I already knew the verbal ones would be contested every step of the way. The courthouse was smaller than I expected, a plain brick building downtown that could have passed for a municipal office, if not for the 2 flags flanking the entrance. Rebecca met me in the lobby 15 minutes early, already reviewing notes on her tablet, and walked me through the process one more time even though we'd been over it twice already. I appreciated the repetition more than I let on. It gave my hands something to focus on besides shaking. The courtroom itself was smaller than the ones I'd seen on television. No elevated jury box, no dramatic wood paneling, just a modest room with rows of gallery seating, a judge's bench at the front, and 2 tables facing it where the opposing parties would sit. Rebecca and I took the table on the right. Across the aisle, my father sat with his attorney, a man in an expensive-looking gray suit who kept glancing at his watch as though this whole proceeding was an inconvenience he intended to resolve quickly. Behind them, the gallery filled in slowly. My aunt arrived first, settling into a seat with the particular energy of someone who considered herself an essential audience member rather than an incidental one. A few cousins followed, then an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, then my brother, who caught my eye briefly across the room and gave me a small, uncertain nod before looking away. My mother came in last, sitting not with my father's side or mine, but in a middle row, equidistant from both, which felt like its own kind of statement even if she hadn't intended it that way. The judge entered a few minutes after 9. A woman I guessed to be in her 60s, silver-haired, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of hearings and had long since stopped being surprised by what families were capable of doing to each other over inheritance. She settled behind the bench, opened a folder, and began reviewing the basic facts of the case out loud. The estate, the trust, the 2 named co-trustees, the dispute over management decisions that had brought both parties before her. This is at its core a disagreement about the administration of a family trust, she said. I'd like to understand the specific concerns before we proceed. Counsel, my father's attorney stood. He spoke smoothly, laying out an argument that sounded reasonable on the surface, that questions had arisen about whether both named co-trustees were equally suited to the responsibility, that his client had concerns about one trustee's judgment predating the current dispute but relevant to it, that the court should consider restructuring the trust's administration to address those concerns. He never said my name during that opening. He didn't have to. When he finished, the judge turned to my father. Sir, I understand you'd like to address the court directly regarding these concerns. My father stood. I watched him take a breath, the kind of breath a person takes before doing something they've rehearsed, and for a moment I actually felt something close to pity, because I recognized the posture. It was the same posture he'd used at every family gathering for 11 years, the practiced delivery of a story he'd told so many times he probably believed every word of it by now. Your Honor, I've watched my daughter struggle with serious issues for over a decade, he began. I've tried to be patient. I've tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. But when it comes to something as significant as my mother's estate, as the safety and future of this family's assets, I can't in good conscience stay silent. He kept going for another minute. Vague references to a difficult history, to patterns that concern the whole family, building towards something without quite naming it, leaving enough ambiguity that if challenged, he could claim he'd never said anything specific. It was a technique I recognized instantly, having watched him use it my entire adult life. Implication as a weapon, deniability built in from the start. For a moment, it seemed to be working exactly as it always had. I could see a few relatives in the gallery nodding along, the same automatic nodding I'd watched my whole life. Agreement offered not because anyone had actually verified anything, but because the story was familiar and my father sounded certain. She's always been unstable. I could almost hear someone thinking. The specifics unnecessary when the shape of the story was this well worn. For 11 years, that shape alone had been enough. Watching it settle over the room again, I understood exactly how much ground he still believed he had, standing there with a story nobody in that gallery had thought to question in over a decade. Then something in him seemed to shift, some restraint finally giving way, and the careful ambiguity fell apart all at once. She's a drug addict, he said, his voice rising, his arm coming up, finger extending toward me across the aisle. That's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. She's a drug addict, and she has been for years, and I will not sit here and pretend that's not directly relevant to whether she should be trusted with anything. The words landed in the room like something physical. I heard my aunt's sharp intake of breath behind me. I felt Rebecca go very still beside me, a stillness I'd come to recognize as her version of alert readiness rather than shock. I kept my own face as neutral as I could manage, though I could feel my pulse in my throat, could feel 11 years of accumulated exhaustion pressing up against 11 years of accumulated patience. The two things finally meeting in a room where, for the first time, someone with actual authority was about to ask the question nobody in my family had bothered to ask in over a decade. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply quickly removed her glasses, set them down on the folder in front of her, and looked at my father with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite disapproval, but something more clinical than either. The look of someone who had heard a great many confident accusations over the course of a long career and had learned exactly how to test them. "Sir," she said, "that's a significant claim, and I want to make sure the court understands exactly what you're basing it on before we go any further. Are you sure you know what she does?" The question hung there for a moment, simple and direct, and something about the specific phrasing seemed to catch my father off guard in a way the accusation itself hadn't. I watched his attorney's pen stop moving mid-word. I watched my father's mouth open slightly before any sound came out, as though the question required a kind of processing he hadn't prepared for, because he'd spent 11 years building an argument entirely around who I used to be and had never once had to defend it against a direct question about who I actually was, right now, in this room, on this day. He started, then stopped. The silence stretched half a second too long to be comfortable. "Yes," he finally said, recovering some of his earlier certainty. "I know exactly what she's been dealing with." "That's not quite what I asked," the judge said. "I asked what she does, her occupation, her present circumstances, not her history." My father's jaw tightened. Across the aisle, I could see his attorney's expression shift slightly, a flicker of something that might have been concern crossing a face that had, until 30 seconds ago, looked entirely unbothered by where this hearing was headed. "She's had problems," my father said, before the judge could press further. "Everyone in this family knows it. She's never been able to hold down anything stable, financially or otherwise. That's what I'm basing this on. Common knowledge, Your Honor. Ask anyone in that gallery." The judge glanced past him toward the rows of relatives, most of whom were nodding slightly, almost involuntarily, the way people nod when a familiar story is repeated back to them, with enough confidence that agreement feels automatic rather than earned. I watched my aunt nod. I watched an uncle nod. I watched, with something between resignation and a strange, distant curiosity, the mechanism of 11 years operating exactly as it always had. Repetition standing in for evidence, consensus standing in for fact. "Common knowledge isn't quite the standard I'm working with here," the judge said, "but let's explore it. What does she do for work currently?" My father hesitated. "Something in counseling, some kind of support role. She's never been specific about it." "Vague how?" "She just doesn't talk about it. Never has." I assumed she didn't want anyone asking too many questions. He said this with a small, knowing shake of his head, as though the vagueness itself were the confirmation of everything he'd already claimed, as though confidentiality and concealment were simply two words for the same thing. For a moment, watching a few more relatives nod along, I understood exactly how close he still was to getting away with it, because vague sounded like evidence if you didn't know what to compare it to. A person who doesn't talk about their job could be hiding something shameful, or they could simply be bound by professional obligations that most people never have to think about. From the outside, without documentation, without anyone actually checking, both explanations sound equally plausible, and my father had spent 11 years counting on nobody bothering to find out which one was true. "She's never held down a stable job," he continued, gaining confidence again. "As far as I know. I don't know what she does day to day. I don't know who she works with. I don't know anything concrete, and that not knowing, after all these years, tells me something on its own." The judge made a note, unhurried. "You're testifying to an absence of information then, not to any specific facts about her current occupation." "I'm testifying to a pattern," my father said. 11 years of a pattern. You don't need every detail to see a pattern. A few people in the gallery murmured something like agreement. My father's attorney, who had gone quiet during the direct exchange with the judge, seemed to relax slightly, apparently deciding that his client had recovered enough ground to be left alone for a moment. It was, I had to admit, a reasonably effective answer. Vague enough to sound principled rather than evasive. Confident enough to reframe the judge's skepticism as simply a lack of familiarity with the situation, rather than a genuine challenge to the claim itself. I felt Rebecca's hand rest lightly on the table beside mine, not touching me, just a small signal. Not yet. I understood. This was the moment my father believed he was winning. The exact shape of the ground he'd been standing on for over a decade. Enough ambiguity, enough repetition, enough relatives nodding along, that the actual facts of my life had simply never needed to enter the conversation. He'd built an entire argument out of the absence of information, and until someone actually supplied that information, the absence would keep functioning as evidence. The judge turned another page in the file in front of her, unhurried, the way she'd been unhurried through the entire hearing so far, and I understood that she was giving my father exactly enough room to fully commit to his position before she asked the next question. It was, I would realize much later, a kind of patience I hadn't seen from anyone in my life in 11 years. The patience of someone willing to let a claim stand or fall entirely on its own weight, rather than deciding in advance which version of the story to believe. "How long ago did the specific incidents you're referencing take place?" she asked. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "A while back." "I'd like a more specific answer." 11, maybe 12 years. "And in that 11 or 12 years, have you had any direct current knowledge of her circumstances? Not impressions, not assumptions based on what she doesn't tell you. Direct knowledge." The pause that followed was longer than the one before it. I watched my father glance briefly toward his attorney, who offered nothing. No whispered guidance, no supportive nod, just a stillness that suggested even he understood the question had narrowed the available answers down to something uncomfortably small. "No," my father finally said. "Not directly. But that doesn't mean—" "I understand your position," the judge said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I'd like to hear from the co-trustee in question now, if that's acceptable to counsel." Rebecca stood. We'd be glad to have her testify, Your Honor. I stood before Rebecca even finished the sentence. My legs felt steadier than I expected, though my hands, resting at my sides, were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Go ahead, the judge said, her tone shifting slightly. Not warmer exactly, but more direct. The tone of someone genuinely interested in what came next, rather than simply managing a formality. For the past 6 years, I said, I've worked in intake and case coordination for a licensed recovery clinic. Before that, I spent 2 years completing training and certification. I've been sober for 11 years. I heard someone in the gallery shift audibly. I didn't turn to see who. My work involves helping people navigate the early stages of recovery, coordinating between clinical staff and patients, managing intake assessments, and maintaining case documentation that meets state licensing requirements. I can't discuss the specifics of individual cases. That's not evasion. That's confidentiality law, and it's the same standard every licensed provider in my field operates under. The judge nodded slowly. Do you have documentation to support what you've described? Yes, Your Honor. Rebecca stepped forward and handed a folder to the clerk, who passed it up to the bench. I'd seen the contents dozens of times by that point, had helped assemble them myself over the preceding weeks, but watching them physically cross the room, watching them land in front of a judge who would actually read them with scrutiny rather than assumption, felt different than I expected. 6 years of pay records, my state licensing certificate, current and unexpired, a letter from my clinical director, written for an unrelated professional reference months before any of this dispute began, describing me in terms I'd never once heard from anyone in my own family. Dependable, precise, someone colleagues trusted with the most vulnerable cases specifically because of the steadiness I brought to the work. The judge began reading, unhurried, turning pages with the same measured pace she'd shown throughout the hearing. The courtroom grew quiet in a different way than it had been quiet after my father's outburst. That earlier silence had been sharp, electric, the silence of people bracing for what might come next. This silence was heavier, more settled, the silence of people watching a story they thought they understood begin to come apart in front of them. I glanced once toward the gallery. My aunt was staring at the folder as though she could read its contents from 20 feet away. My uncle had stopped nodding entirely, his expression somewhere between confusion and the early stages of a discomfort he probably couldn't yet name. My brother was watching me, not the judge, not the papers, just me, with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, something that might have been the beginning of shame on my behalf, or perhaps on his own. For all the years he'd stayed quiet rather than push back on a story he must have known, at some level, didn't quite add up. My father's attorney had stopped writing entirely. He sat with his pen resting on his legal pad, watching the judge read, and I understood, watching him, that he'd already reached the conclusion the judge herself was still working toward. He understood exactly how this was going to end. His client didn't yet, but he did. You've held this position for 6 years, the judge said, not looking up from the file. Yes, Your Honor. And the certification. When was that completed? 7 years ago. I completed a 2-year training program before I was eligible to sit for the licensing exam. She turned another page. There's a citation here, some kind of recognition. A regional award for case management 2 years ago. It's given annually to providers with distinguished outcomes across their caseload. The judge looked up at that briefly, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed it. A small recalibration behind otherwise composed features. She looked past me toward my father for a long moment before returning her attention to the documents. I'd like to continue reviewing this, she said, but I want to ask you one more question directly before I do. Have there been any incidents involving substance use or related legal issues in the past decade? Anything at all? No, Your Honor, nothing. Rebecca stepped forward again, adding a final set of documents to the folder already before the bench. A background clearance required for my professional licensing, renewed annually, each renewal contingent on a clean record. A letter from my sponsor of 9 years, offered voluntarily when I explained the situation to her, describing the consistency of my recovery in terms that had nothing sentimental about them, just dates, meetings attended, the plain administrative record of a life, steadily, unglamorously maintained. The judge accepted the additional pages without comment, but I noticed the pace of her reading slow slightly, as though she were now reading not to verify a claim, but to fully absorb the shape of what she was looking at. Not a person defending herself against an accusation, but a decade of quiet, consistent, thoroughly documented life that had simply never been given the chance to be seen by the one person whose opinion had shaped every family gathering I'd attended for 11 years. The judge closed the folder slowly and set it down on the bench in front of her. For a moment, she said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the courtroom's ventilation system, could hear someone in the gallery shift their weight in a wooden chair, could hear my own pulse in my ears, steady now in a way it hadn't been an hour earlier. She looked at my father directly. Sir, she said, I want to make sure I understand the record correctly before I rule on the underlying dispute. You've testified that your daughter has never held down stable employment, that she's been vague and evasive about her occupation for years, and that this pattern, combined with events from more than a decade ago, forms the basis of your concern about her fitness to serve as co-trustee. That's correct, my father said, though his voice had lost some of the certainty it carried at the start of the hearing. I've now reviewed 6 years of employment records, a current state professional license, a regional distinction for case management, a letter from a supervising clinical director, and 9 years of documented recovery maintenance. She paused, letting each item land individually, rather than blur together into a single dismissible summary. Did you know any of this before today? My father didn't answer immediately. Did you know, the judge continued, that your daughter has spent the last 6 years years working directly, professionally, and by all documented accounts quite successfully, with people recovering from the exact issue you stood in this courtroom and accused her of having? The question didn't echo the way his accusation had. It didn't need to. It simply sat there in the room, plain and unadorned, and I watched it land on my father's face the way a physical weight lands on something not built to hold it. He started. Did you know she holds a professional license that's contingent on a clean background check, renewed annually for the past 6 years? Silence. Did you know she received formal recognition from her field for the quality of her work with the very population you claimed she resembled? Still nothing. My father sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at them, and I understood, watching him, that he wasn't refusing to answer out of stubbornness anymore. He genuinely didn't have an answer. 11 years of a story had just collided, in real time, with 11 years of a life he'd never once bothered to check, and there was nothing in his experience that had prepared him for what it felt like to have both versions sitting in the same room at the same moment, one of them documented and current, the other frozen and 11 years stale. The judge set her glasses down beside the holder. I'll be direct since I think directness is warranted here. Your daughter has spent more than a decade demonstrating exactly the kind of stability, responsibility, and professional judgment that would make her an entirely appropriate choice for the role your mother named her to. The claims you've made today aren't supported by anything in this record. They're supported by an image of her that appears to have stopped updating sometime around when she was 20 years old. She looked at him for a long moment before continuing. You stood in my courtroom this morning and told this court under oath that your daughter is a drug addict. Based on everything now before me, that isn't just outdated. It's the opposite of true. She has spent years working to help people overcome exactly what you accused her of, and she's done it well enough to be recognized for it by people who actually know her work, which is apparently more than I can say for the people in this room who share her last name. Nobody in the gallery made a sound. Nobody in the courtroom moved for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. The judge finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, addressing the room rather than any single person in it. I'll issue my ruling on the trust dispute in writing within the next several days, but I want to say, for the record, that nothing in this proceeding suggests any basis for restructuring the co-trusteeship as requested. She looked at my father one more time. You may want to consider going forward what it means to hold a story about someone for over a decade without once checking whether it's still true. My father didn't respond. He sat there with his hands still flat on the table, staring at nothing. And for the first time in my entire adult life, I watched him have no argument prepared, no rehearsed line, no vague implication to fall back on. Just silence, and beneath it, something that might have finally been the beginning of understanding, arriving 11 years too late to undo any of the holidays, any of the introductions, any of the quiet lowered voices that had followed me through every family gathering since I was 20 years old. The judge gathered her folder and rose. The bailiff called for the room to stand. I stood, and beside me Rebecca gathered our papers with the same brisk efficiency she'd shown all morning, though I caught her glance toward me, just once, something warm and quiet passing between us that had nothing to do with the case anymore. Behind us, the gallery began to empty slowly, relatives filing out in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence they'd walked in with. My aunt didn't look at me on her way out. My uncle did, briefly, an expression on his face I couldn't quite name, somewhere between apology and shame, before he looked away and followed the others toward the door. My father remained seated even after most of the room had cleared, his attorney standing beside him saying something low I couldn't hear. I gathered my coat and turned to leave, and that's when I felt his eyes on me, still fixed to the same spot at the table, still staring at nothing, still sitting inside the 11 years he'd just watched come apart in front of everyone who mattered to him. I didn't wait for him to speak. I didn't owe him that anymore. I walked out of that courtroom into the hallway light, and for the first time in over a decade, I didn't feel the familiar weight of bracing myself for whatever version of me was about to walk through the door behind me.